Hello, I'm Derek with the North Little Rock Public Library System and want to welcome you to Meet the Author. Our guest today, joining us through Zoom, is Mark Barr, author of Watershed. His debut novel, set in 1937 rural Tennessee against the backdrop of the construction of a hydroelectric dam, Watershed delivers a gripping story of characters whose ambitions and yearnings threaten to overflow the banks of their time and place. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you for joining us. I really look forward to this because, as I was saying just a little bit earlier, I really enjoyed your novel.
Wonderful.
Okay, yes. I'll start off by asking you, who inspired you to write?
Well, I think I read a lot when I was young. I was a real avid reader, so I think it was just sort of a natural extension of that I read a lot of fantasy novels when I was a kid. There was always a lot of dragons and things like that. But it was I think it was just an extension of being a reader, and I came by that naturally. My mother's was an English teacher. She had a career at Sylvan Hills Junior High there, not too far from North Little Rock, and definitely was encouraged and to love books and I think it all just kind of grew out of it was just a natural extension of that.
Okay. Did you have any, you've alluded to this in that answer, but did you have any favorite authors when you were growing up or any favorite authors now?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely yeah I think I was a little less discerning, I guess. I mean,
hmm
I was a typical kid. I really liked we get those scholastic sheets from school when you can sort of pick out the books. I probably was terrible about picking books out by their covers because I would just whatever looked good to me. But so I read just a lot. And then currently, yes, I definitely have favorite authors now. I think college was a real turning point for me
Ah,
when
mhm.
I came across William Faulkner.
Ah,
Was a big a big sort of the light going on in my head
mhm,
sort of moment with him.
mhm.
And then today I mean there are quite a few people I like now. I'm trying to think, of course, now I don't really think of them. Cormac McCarthy is someone that I'm a big fan of. He's written he wrote some stuff in Tennessee and then kind of through
Okay.
the Southwest. Um, and I'm trying to think who else. I don't know. I draw a blank now trying to come up with
Okay.
other people.
That
But
that that that's okay. Because when you said William Faulkner, I used to live in northern Mississippi, and he was I mean, not about 30 miles from Oxford, and so I mean, um, he was a very popular author to be taught in the college where I worked, and so that just rang a bell. Yes. Okay.
yeah, yeah. When I got my undergrad at Hendrix College, and as we
Mhm.
had a Faulkner class that we could take, that we took a field trip to Oxford,
Mm.
in a few days there, and that was really kind of important to me, maybe as a young writer, was to kind of
Mm.
just sort of cross that threshold between like thinking of authors as these sort of people up on pedestals to sort of you could go to Oxford and see where Faulkner lived and here's his house. Here's some of the some of the terrain and cityscape that sort of inspired some of
Mhm.
his settings.
Mhm.
That was all really, I think, important in my development.
Okay. Right. When you began your writing career, did anyone give you any advice as to, in any aspect, how to write or how to get published or anything like that?
I mean, I'm sure I got lots of advice. There was no sort of one key piece, I guess.
Mhm,
I did go to
mhm,
graduate school in
mhm,
writing, and that was really important for me. And
mhm,
it's sort of it's a nice place to kind of think about writing a lot,
mhm,
and then be surrounded by a community of people who are also thinking a lot about writing
mhm.
and talking about it. Uh, uh, I'm trying to think of, I mean, if probably if I can think of like writing advice, if someone asks me for advice, the things that come to mind are like, you know, write revision is writing was one we used to say in grad school that was really kind of, I think, important. And that you're never, we read books and we sometimes think of like this is a book is a linear process from the beginning to the end, and we read them that way, but they aren't written that way. There's a lot of rework and revising and maybe moving this section there because of the overall shape of the story. But so I'm a big believer in rewriting, but also in being with the work when I'm working on a project, trying to be with the work on a daily basis. That's really important. If I'm writing something new, I need to do something with it. However many days a week I'm trying to work, I will try to make sure it's more important to me than spending, like, if I had like a whole day to just work on something, or I had an hour or two on 4 or 5 days, the 4 or 5 days would be much better, because you kind of are like, you're touching the work and then coming away from it. And then sort of, there's something about entering that space, the world of the story. And there's really something, I think it takes a while. You can't just immediately be there. But by coming to it every day, you sort of can stay semi-present in it, I guess, or in a way that the second day it's easier to kind of get there, I find.
Okay. All right.
That'd be, I don't know, there's some advice for you. That's all I can think of.
Well, it's just, when you said that, it just rang I guess what you would call a Proustian moment when you talked about revision, graduate school, and just reminded me one time when I got a chapter back on my dissertation and there was more red on it than there was black, and I was furious. But the advisor knew what he was doing. And so, yes, and so it just brought that back to mind. Yes.
Yeah, I think there's different parts of the process, or different, like there's something to be said for sort of that spontaneous sort of, what we think of as like a burst of inspiration that causes you to write some stuff down. But that doesn't necessarily, and that sometimes is really exciting, but that's just one aspect of it. You need to, Faulkner was famous for saying you have to be able to kill your darlings, and to come back and maybe decide, I really liked this bit that I wrote about, a bathtub and peanut butter, but doesn't part of this story. I need to maybe be willing to cut that for the larger story to, succeed.
Okay.
And I think that is important.
Okay. Well, let's, if you're willing, at this point, let's talk about your book, Watershed.
Sure.
One of the things that I noticed that really impressed me was the amount of research that you must have done to make it sound like the 1930s. For instance, I noticed you brought up the word slide rule, and you brought up the word pomade, and I knew what that was. And then just the amount of research that you did for the engineering aspect of the dam. And then you brought up a colored saloon. And I've just got to ask you, before I go on any further, how did you know that a colored saloon would look different, and how did you find out what it would look like? If you can remember. Yeah,
I don't know if I have a really good answer for that. I mean, the research was, it was an important part. This is an historical fiction novel, so there's a lot of research that went into it. Luckily, we live in the era of the internet, where there's a lot of there was a key tool for me in researching, in terms of the pomade and the other things, was looking at vintage advertising. I found that if you go and look at what a society is trying to sell to people, you get a sense of what is important, or what you sometimes come across interesting details about things that are true in day-to-day lives for people of the time that it might be different from today. So there was that. And then, as far as in the engineering stuff, was really important that I found, well, a lot of that was coming out of the war projects era and the New Deal, which was 1930s. And they kept a lot of records. And at the time that I was writing the book, I was living in Austin, Texas, and I was able to, the UT Engineering Library which is like a subset of the main library there at the university, had all of these. I think the thing that really was pay dirt for me was I found the payroll ledgers for the project that just listed all of the various jobs, like all the hundreds of all the different roles people were playing in a hydroelectric dam project. and sort of that sort of stuff kind of became sort of the bedrock of my story. It allowed me to sort of, pick and choose just enough details. There's always I get tricked to
Mm-hmm.
dropping enough details in that something seems real. You know, I mean, it's sort of like seasoning, I guess, in food. You put all the salt in, it's not going to work. But so you have to get just the right amount or just enough to kind of make people like. I'll just tell you a big secret. I don't know how to build a hydroelectric dam. I've never built one. And yet you can sort of imagine what I have worked on large software projects, for instance, and then it's possible to think, well, that in this kind of process we have these sorts of tasks. How might that be analogous to something like this? And therefore, what do we talk about in staff meetings, and how's that going to maybe play out in this other world? And it sort of allows you to sort of map a reality that onto a reality that you don't know, sort of making up. So, and if you do it right, if you find this right balance, you kind of pull the reader along, into this world.
Yeah. Well, along the same lines, it was just the notion that you felt like you were in the 1930s because of Claire, and the fact that her husband has obviously been unfaithful to her, given her an STD, but her mother is still saying, you need to go back to him. And I'm thinking that was probably so typical of 1930s. Here's a woman, you don't have a job. In fact, marriage, and I'm not making fun of marriage. I'm very much in favor of marriage, but it was the notion it was just the most important thing for a woman and a man. You had to stay together. Whereas if you were writing in the 2020s, that would never fly. But you wrote it in such a way that it wasn't preaching at the reader, but you let him or her know this is the way life was in 1930s. It was expected. You're supposed to go back to your husband, even though he's really been unfaithful. And I just thought you did a brilliant job on that.
Thanks. I mean, a lot of that's coming out of the fact that women in the 1930s didn't much work outside the home, and didn't really have educational and career opportunities quite the same way. Some of that was starting to happen, and we got more of that in World War II,
Yes.
as there were just no more men at home to do those jobs. But the 30s was an interesting time when some of that was starting to happen. People were going away, men were traveling away to sort of find whatever work there was. So that was a lot of fun to write about Claire, and to sort of, as someone who is sort of taking her first steps at a career outside the home.
Okay. Another thing that I think you're really talented at is writing about, and I don't know how to put this but any other way, but biological functions, and doing a very great job. Let me explain. You talk about the blood poisoning from concrete. I never knew about that. You talked about the very first page, Claire has got the symptoms of gonorrhea, and you don't just say, she's got it and then just move on. I mean, several pages later, she's still recovering from it, and the physical pain that she's going through, and I don't know what the proper word for it, and I know you don't use it in the book, but I can't think of the proper word, but I'm going to use it anyway. You talk about the men who are farting. I'm sorry, but that's exactly what it is. But you're very good about doing it in a way that's entertaining, but it's part of the story to make it believable. People do these things. And I just wanted to bring that up because you do a great job.
Well, thanks. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to write about, a group of, these are working class people. They're not, there's not a lot of education at the time. There's just a lot of, and I think a lot of these people's lives were very physical. They had physical jobs, and they would think about, their physical bodies and how they would function, or how they would, not function in the case of like the blood poisoning or illness. And I think that kind of drove a lot of it, that these were people who sort of lived in the moment in their bodies, and I wanted to kind of capture that. And I'm glad it worked for you.
Yes. Okay. Another thing I thought you were really good at is writing about fighting, fist fighting. You had the dog fighting and then the subsequent fight that came along. But the fight that I really enjoyed was the one between Nathan and Travis, and the fact that Nathan faints. Now, let me explain something. when I've watched television and movies, generally people will faint, and they fall over. And that can happen, you know. But the way you wrote it was this took several pages before he finally collapses. And I thought, you know, I'll bet a lot of people do faint that way. And it was the first time I've ever seen it written that way. And I just want to commend you on that. You did a great job as opposed to just saying in one or two sentences, he got hit and he fell down. You went into a lot of detail and just wanted to commend you on that.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I was thinking about, just the delayed effects of the sort of the fight they've been in, and perhaps he's going into shock. He's got a pretty bad shoulder injury, and he's been, hit in the head several times. Yeah, but it was fun. It was fun to write those things.
Okay, very good. Okay. A chapter I really liked was chapter 17. It's only one page, and it's the little boy who finds a friend in Tom. It was so succinct. And granted, he's buying his friendship. He gives the magazine and he takes the candy over. But it was just so well done, and just you could tell he was lonely, and Tom probably was too, and maybe didn't even know it. And you did a brilliant job in one page talking how a friendship can develop.
Yeah, thank you.
What made you? How did that develop, or comment on? I'll just leave it up to you what you would like to discuss about that.
Okay. I mean, so the main characters for anyone who's reading the book are Claire. And we got Nathan, who's an engineer who's coming from out of town, but Claire is sort of the local person, and so those are the two pieces of my story. And Claire has two children from her marriage. This is an interesting story for you, maybe. So when I first wrote the book, it's interesting to me how the children changed over. So I took a really long time to write this book. It was like 12 years spread over about an 18-year window. I spent a really long time writing, revising, and just sort of slowly writing it.
Okay. Before you go any further, don't take another 12 years, because I liked this book, and I'm not going to live that long. So continue.
I'm trying very hard to improve my process.
Okay.
But one of the byproducts of it was it was such a long window, but that during that time I married and had children.
Okay.
And so the children that I'd written prior to that were very different than the children I eventually had in my story, because I realized, these aren't even, they were dramatic problems I was trying to get out of the way so that Claire could go on and do other things in the story. And so I was in coming back to sort of revisit the children, like I'd maybe given them, short shrift, that Tom, became, he'd already been a character in a few scenes with Nathan. I'd spent a lot of time just trying to think up sort of permutations of my characters, what advances my story, but also gives me a chance to sort of bring other people in, and how can I make them all work together. And Tom had shown up a few times, and I liked him, and I was interested in how he might be growing up to be like his father, and what that might look like, and just sort of in tracking his sort of growth. And I wanted to, capture that. And I think that's part of what was going on there, was just, I was thinking, just trying to come through, like what would a child, and I had a childhood myself, so I was able to remember what kind of things kids did or talked about, or and that's where that came from.
Okay, well, I just have to reiterate, I just love that chapter. It was just a beautiful chapter, just to me, to encapsulate everything about friendship, and just people can be lonely and you just don't even know. And I just thought you did a brilliant job on that. So thank you. Yes.
I think actually now I don't remember. It's been long enough since I read the book to remember exactly 17, but I'm guessing is that we have the sort of the red-haired boy who's sort of
yes,
and Tom, and they've sort of become friends. Yes. And the red-haired boy, I should mention, he's another child in the book, but one of the things I was interested in I'm in writing sort of dramatic fiction. There's a lot of, you have characters and they're individuals. But you're also trying to tell the big story, right? I mean, I'm trying to tell about electrification of the countryside.
Yes.
And so there's sort of the big picture stuff. And the red-haired boy and his family were sort of a tool I used to add to my palette, to kind of give me sort of the everyman, and sort of like it gave me a place to sort of look at, like, how a society might, one, embrace this new thing, and how they might resist it. which is always the case. There's always sort of both, some people are really excited and some people are like, don't change my life.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of push and pull. And so that's where he was. And then, it was kind of fun to then sort of where his storyline and Tom's sort of cross a bit. And I got to sort of bring them both together.
All right. Okay. You've got a brilliant line in your book that I hope I'll get an opportunity to use. There in the scene where Nathan is working in the, I don't know what you'd call it. It's not a dormitory, the house where all the other men are staying.
Yeah. He's in a boarding house.
Boarding house, yes. Couldn't think of the word. Overnight, he's doing something and he's making a lot of noise, and Hull kind of lets him know about it. You kind of kept me awake, sort of thing. And Nathan says, well, I'll try not to make that noise again, or try not to be noisy, something along those lines. And Hull has the brilliant answer. He says, do more than try. I just love that, because you hear this all the time with people. Well, I'll try not to do it the next time. And I want to be able to say that, do more than try, because I don't plan to spend all night. I just thought it was a beautiful line. How did you come up? Do you know how you came up with it? Or maybe it's just too long to remember, but I loved it. I just want to be able to use it. I hope someone will do something to me so I can say that, do more than try.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where that came from.
Okay. All right.
You're writing dialogue and you sort of are like, you're trying to think about what the character might say. And pretty antagonistic.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Nathan's anxieties have been bothering him, and he'd been pacing around his room, and I guess there's a squeaky floorboard or something.
Yeah. Okay.
Stepped on a few times, and the hole was sort of being gruff with him.
Okay. It isn't something that I think the ending of the novel is realistic, and I'm not going to reveal it because I don't want to spoil people, have a spoiler. But I will put it this way: you know how, and like those children's fairy tales, and everyone lived happily ever after. Well, it's not that they don't live don't live happily ever after, but it wasn't the ending I was expecting with Nathan and Claire. I wasn't disappointed, but I thought it was realistic, so I thought you did a great job. How did you decide on your ending? And I'm not asking you to reveal things to spoil the reader, but maybe you could tell us, how did you decide how you were going to end the novel?
I mean, endings, I will say endings are hard. Endings are really hard because, like you mentioned, your expectations. There's a lot of, so when you're writing as a book and you're coming, you spent years on something and you're coming towards the conclusion, you're aware of what things look like, what might happen. And so it's all a balancing act to try to decide, like, what is the emotional impression I want the reader to be left with? How do I, what do I want them sort of resonating with as they they close it and think their last thoughts about the book? And I don't know, at the same time, there are expectations. So it's kind of a game of sort of trying to decide, are you going to play to what seems where things are going? Or are you going to try to repudiate that and come the other way? Or are you going to try to, and I think I was trying to sort of find some middle ground to sort of try, and it does. It's I think a very realistic ending.
Okay. Yes.
I'm trying not to give it away. Sorry.
Right. I mean, it's, because you don't want people, I'll just be quiet on that, because but don't be too surprised if people write to you, maybe more women than men, but email or whatever, and just say, hey, I was expecting this kind of ending. Yeah.
I have. I've had a few.
Oh, you have? Okay.
Yeah, I have. I definitely have. I've heard something about that.
Okay. Yeah.
And some people think perhaps they wonder if I was setting up a sequel.
Were you?
I was not.
Oh, okay.
That's the question I get asked a lot.
Okay. All right.
I'm not opposed to it, but it's nothing that I'm.
That you were planning. Okay. Yeah. All right. I'm just curious. How did you find? I'm going to change now to the actual business part just for a second. How did you pick your publisher, or how did you get your publisher?
Well, I have an agent. So I went a pretty traditional route. There are a lot of people today that self-publish. That's an avenue that's open for a lot of people. I had an agent, so which is a process of, like, they usually like you to have the book finished. because I've been in graduate school, I just known people who
Mm-hmm.
had gotten agents and knew people. So it just seemed like a realistic way I might go. And it was, it was a process of when I'd read books I liked or books I thought were like my book, I would look at the acknowledgments at the back, which is where
Mm-hmm.
the author usually says, thank you to these people and thank you to my spouse and thank you. And they'll usually mention their agent in there. And it's a good way to sort of
Oh.
find agents that maybe, because agents represent authors they like typically, and because they need to be able to believe in the work to try to sell it.
Mm-hmm.
And just in case everyone's not aware, so the way it usually works, big publishers usually don't want to deal with an individual author. Um, and so usually an agent is a person that sort of exists in that space between the author and a publisher.
Mm-hmm.
And an agent then will have they have some authors they represent, but they also have a list of publishers and editors that they maintain contact with. And they know, oh, this is, so in my case, my agent, knew my editor, Meg Reed at Hub City Press, and she knew she was really interested in Southern fiction, which is, describes what my book is. And so they periodically would meet. And she said, I think I've got the novel for you. And it turned out Meg did like it. And it was really, so Hub City Press, they're out of South Carolina, Spartanburg, South Carolina. And I can't recommend enough. It was a really wonderful experience all around. They're really great. And then I will mention, and I just luckily fell into just around the time my deal was going through, Charles Frazier, who wrote Cold Mountain. You may know of him. He's it was a big,
Okay.
I mean, a movie, and he sold
Yes.
books. He had around that same time was coming back, was interested. He was friends with some people at Hub City and was thinking he would like to endow a sort of a series. And so they created it's called the Cold Mountain Fund series, but it's a series of sort of marquee books that Hub City put out and that focus on the South. That are sort of literary fiction set in the South, and I was lucky enough to be one of those, which was wonderful because then it meant there's some more money for a book tour and some promotional stuff. It's really good.
Well, congratulations on that. That's an interesting story, and I'll explain why I asked it, because authors will see this program, and some of them are just they want it, anyone can write a book, but it's getting it published, and so any bits of information, and yours is very useful for that aspect. Okay.
Wonderful. I hope I can be helpful.
All right. All right. Well, Mark, if you're willing, at this juncture in the program, if you're willing, we would like to hear you read a small section from your novel, and I'll be quiet and I'll let you begin.
All right. I was thinking I'd read just a small bit about from Nathan.
Okay.
In the beginning. I don't think there's anyone. I think it's all hopefully not too confusing. All right, so this is Nathan in the boarding house, and then I'm leaving. All right. I will say, I guess. So Nathan sometimes brings work home. He's trying really hard to get ahead. He has a probationary period in which he has to sort of prove himself, and so he'll bring work home. And that's all. After a while, Nathan went up to his room and spread out his work on the secondary controls he had promised Mofrey. But the air was hot and still, and he found himself squinting in the weak light of his lamp. As he struggled with it, he heard the sounds of the household turning in. He worked on until a splinter of pain began to press its way through his skull, and he had to abandon the drawings. He sat back on his chair, rubbing his face, then stood and went to the door, listening. The house was silent. As quietly as he could, he opened his door and slipped out. The moon was not yet risen, and the town was quiet and dark, with only the small lights of oil lamps in the houses. The orange glowings of cigarettes and cigars shone on the front porches where people silently regarded him. Here and there, a breeze kicked up, and he could hear the murmur of conversations. Behind a picket fence, a dog wore itself out, barking. Nathan followed the street into the town proper, passing black and silent stores. He came once more to the elm, where the children had been looking over the wreck a few days before. In the night, it was a hulking thing, its trunk thrusting upward into the darkness. He felt around its girth with his hands until he found the cuts the car had left in it. They were dry now, the wounds stanched by the hardened sap. The crickets were singing, and the scents of summer flowers drifted in the air. His hand went to his jacket pocket and withdrew the envelope with the newspaper clipping. It was too dark to see, but he remembered her face clearly. The newspapers had gotten their hands on the photo from her employment file. In it, her expression was serious. Had another car come along like the first and missed the curve in the road, its headlights would have found Nathan Miller sitting at the tree's base, his head low, the clipping that had been addressed to him in his hands. But there were no more cars that night, and he was alone and unknown, swaddled by the complete darkness.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Oh, it just typifies just, I wish I was more literate in terms of words, but just it's a good picture of what you're going to read when you read this book. You couldn't have picked a better choice. It was just brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yes. Mark, if people want to buy this book or contact you in any way, are you in social media?
Yes, I am. I have a website, www.readmarkbarr.com.
Okay.
It has a link to buy the book. It directs you to Hub City Press, who sells it. And I am on Facebook and Twitter as well.
Okay. All right. Well, this has been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed this. So I'll say goodbye to you, and I'll thank our audience for joining us today, because it has been a pleasure. If you're interested in reading more from Mark Barr, please visit us at the library or find us online at Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or our website, nlrlibrary.org. Join us again next time, and have a great day, everyone.